Hello, I am Commissioner Emma I. Darnell, Fulton County District 6. Welcome to Mighty Six Conversations. As you know, Conversations is a monthly information and communication program focusing on the sustainable community, economically strong, environmentally safe, with liberty and justice for all. Subject for today's conversation, Bloody Sunday and the right to vote. Yesterday's victories, today's challenges. Thank you for joining us. I'll be back in a moment. Joining me in the conversation today is Mrs. Phyllis D. Bailey. Mrs. Bailey is a retired educator, historian, and advocate for senior adults. Ms. Bailey earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Economics from Howard University, a Master's degree in Education from the University of Virginia, and a Master's degree in Guidance and Counseling from Virginia Tech University. Welcome, Mrs. Bailey.
Thank you so much for the opportunities, Commissioner Darnell.
Thank you so much for joining us once again as we look at our history
Yes.
within the context of today's challenges. Today, as I indicated, we mark the 52nd anniversary of Bloody Sunday and the right to vote. Of course, many people know what happened on that day. 500 people involved in a peaceful protest, marching from Selma, they thought, to Montgomery to protest against discrimination against blacks in voting. And we know what happened.
Yes.
They were beaten, tear gassed, run over by horses, all under the authority of the state of Alabama. We call it Bloody Sunday because blood was shed.
Yes.
A lot of us know what happened that day, but today we want to talk about what happened before Selma and what happened since Selma. Don't you think we might need to put that Bloody Sunday in context? We know many of the people who were there, who led the march. Mrs. Amelia Boynton of the Selma movement, Hosea Williams, SCLC, and of course, Congressman John Lewis, who represented SNCC.
Yes.
In that march, with 500 of them, tear gas, beaten.
Attacked.
They didn't make it to Montgomery that day. But would you put that in context for us, Ms. Bailey? Because actually, in 1965, we had the right to vote on paper, didn't we?
Yes. As of 1865, we were given freedom from slavery. In 1868, you received citizenship. But because of all the people who somehow just could not accept that, there came in 1870 the 15th Amendment, which was the third of the Civil Rights Amendments, which gave us the right to vote. And as you say, this was on paper, that we were given the right to vote.
That was the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution.
Yes, ma'am. And
we voted for a while, didn't we?
For a while, yes. And there were people who served in high positions. For instance, from Louisiana, you had the senator, and you had one from
These are the United States senators.
Yes. But after that, when the Reconstruction came into being and certain elements retook the southern states' governments, they reinstituted the kinds of restrictions that slavery had placed on African Americans. And this was done through Jim Crow laws, through intimidations by the Ku Klux Klan, by economic deprivation of our ancestors, all of which,
Violence too, right?
intense violence, lynchings. You think in terms of the young woman who was hanged and whose child was cut from her at the road. I think it was, I can't remember the name of the exact road, but it was just horrible. And the thing that made it even worse is that these people brought their children to see this done.
To see the lynching.
Yes.
So during Reconstruction, all of the gains that had been made were rolled back.
Yes. And the sad part about this is that it seems that every time we get to a point that we think we have accomplished, we encounter someone or some movement that makes a concerted effort to push us back. And seemingly today we have come again to a point wherein things are being dismantled.
But on March the 2nd, 1965, the Selma to Montgomery March, that bloody Sunday,
Yes.
that march ended in a disaster.
Yes.
But 2 weeks later,
2 weeks later.
2 weeks later, when the nation witnessed that violence,
The world.
the world
Oh,
witnessed that
resisted
violence,
violence.
then the Congress of the United States and the President
Yes.
of the United States. First, I guess the President moved, right?
Yes,
Since the
President
National
Johnson.
Guard,
Mhm.
25,000
Yes.
on that second march. And they made it to Montgomery.
Yes, they did.
They were black and white and
And-
yellow.
yes.
They were rabbis.
Yes.
They were imams. They were pastors. It was everybody.
It was a world that recognized what had happened, and they were attempting to in some way ensure that this would not be the case going forth.
And then finally Congress acted.
Yes. Congress acted with the passage of this bill that said that this would no longer be a problem and that any area that had a history of discriminating
Mostly
in the
the
South.
southern
Yes,
South, the
yes.
South, and I think a few Southwest
Southwest,
states,
but
like
mostly
Texas,
in
but
the
mostly
deep
in the
South. And this particular bill had as a part of it Section 5,
Voting Rights Act,
which required the U.S. Department to pre-clear,
pre-clearance.
yes, to pre-clear any attempt to change any voting qualification or prerequisite to voting or standard of practice or procedure with respect to voting. That particular section gave the Justice Department the arm, the authority to be sure that African Americans and those who had been the victims of discrimination would be allowed to vote without interference.
So that if a state wanted to change their voting rules in any way, they could not
That's
do
right.
so until the proposed change was reviewed and approved
Yes.
by the Justice Department.
Yes.
That was the Section
Section 5.
5 of the Voting Rights
Rights
Act of
yes.
1965. And the effect was significant.
Yes, it
wasn't
was. Yes, it was. Thousands were able to vote. Thousands were able to be a part of the government.
No more poll tax.
No more poll tax.
No more counting
literacy
jelly
tests.
beans in
Yes.
a jar.
Literacy tests that an illiterate was interpreting. And that in itself
No more
was,
interpretations of
yes,
the Constitution.
Yes. None of that.
Yes.
But the only area in Georgia that eventually got exempt was Sandy Springs. And they were able to be exempt under a provision of the law which allowed because they had demonstrated over a period of time that they had not had these problems.
Let's go back to the pre-clearance
All right.
provision. The pre-clearance provision actually resulted in many of us who are in elective office today. That was made possible because people were not inhibited from voting
Yes.
because of race.
That's true.
And that was 1965.
Yes.
And the Congress continued to renew that provision. I think
Yes.
all the way up to 2006.
Yes, when
The
President
Congress
Bush
renewed it. Was that?
Mhm.
They
George
renewed
Bush,
it.
Yeah, renewed it every time.
And so all of the restrictions, and the Justice Department was reviewing all of the proposed changes
Yes.
and all of the changes that would have operated to restrict Black Americans from voting were not approved.
That's true.
And then along comes Shelby County
Against Eric
versus
Holder.
Eric Holder. We want to talk about that when we come back. We'll be back in a moment for part 2 of our conversation, Bloody Sunday. Ms. Bailey, we were talking about the victory of Bloody Sunday, the adoption of the Voting Rights Act, and how for, at least 20 years
20
maybe,
at least.
the Congress continued to renew it,
Yes.
and any voting change that was contemplated by any of these pre-clearance states and jurisdictions was reviewed by the Justice Department so that bad law was prevented,
Yes.
because many of these folks, they didn't have the resources to go to court after the fact. But then in 2013, in a case called Shelby County versus Eric Holder, the Supreme Court made a decision that had an enormous impact upon that voting rights provision. Tell us about that, Ms. Bailey.
At that time, the Supreme Court decided that Section 5, which was the strong arm of that bill.
That was the pre-clearance.
Yes, the pre-clearance bill. The Supreme Court decided that the Section 5 was unconstitutional. And that virtually destroyed any possibility of preventing what is happening today. Because Section 5 is no longer valid, and the Supreme Court decided that the Congress would eventually pass another law to supplant that. And of course, the Congress had no interest in doing that.
The Supreme Court shifted it to the United States Congress
Yes.
because it was a concern about the restriction to the certain states.
Certain southern states felt that they would not be able to function.
And also, Ms. Bailey, wasn't there some language saying that actually, even though there may have been some discrimination in voting remaining, that things had changed
Yes. That was what they proposed.
Better.
They claimed that voting was now being carried out equally for all, which was not the case.
We need to talk about that a little bit, Ms. Bailey, because the Brennan Center for Justice, the civil rights community have taken the position that Shelby County case, where the Supreme Court set aside pre-clearance, has placed us pretty much in the same situation we were in on March the 7th,
That's right.
1965. And they point to certain actions that have been taken by these pre-clearance states since June of 2013. And I frankly have been amazed at some of the kinds of actions.
First, there was gerrymandering, which
Go
was,
ahead.
of
What
course,
are some of these?
gerrymandering gives
District lines?
district lines, and the politicians who are in power at that point are able to redraw those lines at will. And of course, the lines have been drawn to support certain groups, maintaining control and keeping others from voting.
The problem with some of those lines is that the way they drew them, they diluted
Yes.
the impact of the
Officer,
black
yes.
and minority vote. Is that correct?
That is correct. And with that, of course, I think in terms of our folk are not paying attention. The lines are drawn, and people are elected who do not have their best interests at heart.
I also noted in the article from the Brennan Center that some of the kinds of actions that the states have taken would not have even developed
that's
had
true.
the pre-clearance
It's stayed in
provision been in place.
That's true.
They point out that right here in our state of Georgia, since Shelby down in Macon, Bibb County, a polling place that was in a black community in a gym was moved to the sheriff's office.
Yes.
Now, it's unlikely that a polling place would have been moved down in Macon from a black neighborhood in a gym to the sheriff's office had the pre-clearance provision.
Oh, that wouldn't have even been proposed, probably. But knowing that they could get away with this because Section 5 was no longer in force.
But on your point, though, Ms. Bailey, what happened in Macon was it went challenged. It was challenged. And the community organized, circulated petitions, and they had to change it. They had to change back to a location that would be convenient to all people, particularly those who were disenfranchised.
But the problem becomes that people have to do this. When Section 5 was in place, this would never even have been a problem, simply because this would never have passed that inspection. And so the people who pushed this would never have even suggested it had that Section 5 still been in force.
And unfortunately, many of these changes, like changing registrations and changing early voting and all of these other kinds of changes, right here, our own Secretary of State here in Georgia lost 300,000 votes purging the rolls. But many of these things, as you indicated, would not have happened had the Justice Department had an opportunity to look at them. But what's unusual about Macon is that while most of these changes really have been unnoticed, as you pointed out, and unchallenged, down in Macon, it wasn't Bloody Sunday. It was a petition.
But the thing about
But they got it changed.
Yes. And so now the burden of proof falls on those who are victimized, because now they have to organize to challenge that change, wherein Section 5 made it such that this wasn't necessary, because this area would have had a history of discrimination. Therefore, they would not have been able to do these kinds of things.
Well, actually, we mentioned Georgia, but actually throughout the South and the Southwest. North Carolina, for an example, has one of the worst cases of voter ID. Texas had a terrible case of voter ID. But over and over again, though, these district courts are striking down many of these laws. And it is my understanding, once again from the Brennan report, that the Congress of the United States has developed legislation that would have reduced and eliminated the effect of the elimination of the pre-clearance provision, but it's languishing in Congress. Nothing Nothing is happening.
That's the sad part, I suppose, because you have people who are representing an area whose interests are contrary, seemingly, to striking down this kind of behavior. And you have to wonder, first of all, you get back to the voting. Because if we are registered to vote, and these people who have not stood for what is correct or what is right, then we need to vote them out of our office.
So they're giving me the signal, Ms. Bailey, but what I hear you saying is that we know what happened on Bloody Sunday. We know what happened before.
Yes.
And we know what happened after Bloody Sunday. Temporary victories, you pointed that out at the very beginning. Temporary victories. But Shelby versus Holder has taught us that these victories are temporary.
Yes.
Is that correct?
And you must watch.
You have to watch.
You must watch. Because the moment you start to assume that this is yours by birth or whatever, you tend to lose. And this is what has happened.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Thank you
You're
so
quite
much.
welcome.
I'll be back in a moment with closing thoughts. March 7, 1965, Bloody Sunday, another marker, another memorial, another stone in the river of American history, a turbulent history which continues every day toward a more perfect union. What is the real meaning of this stone? Future generations may want to know. That's all the time we have for today's conversation. Until next time, my friends and neighbors, stay strong. To learn more about today's conversation, contact me at 404-612-8222. That's 404-612-8222. You can also email me at emma.darnell@fultoncountyga.gov. Visit us online at emmadarnell.com or connect with us on Facebook or Twitter.